Representative Learned, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative. I want to ask also about the birth certificate. So under the amendment, you're talking about the official birth certificate at or near the time of birth is, I think, the answer you gave. My question is about kids who are adopted and might not have the original birth certificate from when they were born. What happens if those kids' identity is questioned?
Representative Tuck, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question, Representative. We didn't contemplate that. However, I can look into what we intend to do with that and get back to you on it.
Representative Learned, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since this amendment we could be voting on in 5 minutes could harm and prevent any kid who's been adopted from playing in youth sports in this state, can we agree on tabling this amendment until we've solved this problem?
Representative Tuck, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question, Representative. Since presenting a birth certificate is already part of the pre-eligibility requirements for the FHSAA, and it hasn't been an issue in the past, I don't believe it would be an issue based on this amendment.
Representative Learned, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's never been an issue in the past because right now they're allowed to use the amended birth certificate. What your amendment does is it means that they cannot use that amended birth certificate. They have to use the original one, which might have been sealed because they're adopted. So this presents a new problem that's going to harm every adopted child in this state who wants to play youth sports. And my question is, can we wait until we solve this problem before we put this, try to ram this vote down on the 11th hour?
Representative Tuck, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question, Representative. As stated previously, if it's part of the pre-eligibility requirements and it hasn't been an issue in the past, I don't believe it would be an issue right now. I understand the concern regarding the amended birth certificate. However, there's nothing in this amendment that contemplates the difference between an amended and original in your specific scenario where we don't know if there's an original versus an amended.
Representative Learned, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to refer you to line 38 of your amendment that says that the birth certificate needs to be filed at or near the student's time, the time of the student's birth. So this affects not only kids that are adopted, but any student whose parents might have lost their birth certificate through the process. So my question is, doesn't this amendment preclude any adopted kid or any kid whose parent has lost their original birth certificate from playing youth sports in the state of Florida?
Representative Tuck, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you again for the question, Representative. It appears that in the adoption law, whenever you have an amended birth certificate, it replaces the original for all intents and purposes, so I think that would satisfy your concern on that front.
Representative Learned, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So in that example, then, any amended birth certificate could be used to satisfy this provision. That was your answer, is that correct?
Representative Tuck, you're recognized.
In the specific scenario of adoption, it's my understanding that whenever there is not an original birth certificate and there is only an amended birth certificate, it has the amended birth certificate has the exact same legal footing as an original birth certificate.
Representative Learned, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative. And I really wish we had a chance to work this out before we had to be on microphones talking about it, because I think this is a really important issue that's going to affect a lot of kids across the state of Florida. I know I'm trying to go through an adoption process. I know a lot of kids, people in this room have been adopted, and we're certainly not trying to ban them from sports. So I think my understanding of your answer is that amended birth certificates, regardless of whether they were amended at the time of birth or later, could be used to verify a student's gender because the birth certificate includes the gender on the document.
Representative Tuck, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question, Representative. This amendment is meant to use the original birth certificate assigned at birth. In the rare scenario where there is not an original birth certificate, the amended birth certificate is substituted for the original, and that is my understanding of the adoption law.
Representative Learned, you're recognized.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. I can't let that one go. So under the rare circumstance, so I'm trying to go through an adoption. I'm sure other people are trying to go through adoptions right now. Thousands, tens of thousands of kids in Florida are adopted. This is not an insignificant thing that only affects a tiny number of people. This affects a ton of Floridians. We're not talking about a small micro group here. Can we work on this issue to make sure that these adopted kids can play youth sports in the state of Florida? Can we postpone this, figure this out, and then come back?
Representative Tuck, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question again, Representative. As I stated previously, and I didn't mean to make it sound like this specific scenario was insignificant at all. That was not my intent. In the case of an adopted child where there is no original birth certificate, the amended is substituted for the original. But there isn't every case where the original is lost. This amendment is meant to use the original birth certificate.
Representative Learned, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you, Representative. I want to go back to one of the questions that we were talking about earlier as it pertains to younger kids. You kept saying that the birth certificate is required for the FHSAA. I want to ask about the younger kids. So middle school students in particular, adopted middle school students, would they be able to participate in sports?
Representative Tuck, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. Yes, they're still able to participate in middle school sports.
Representative Learned, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if their gender was questioned and they needed to provide the birth certificate and they didn't have the original birth certificate because they were adopted, what documentation would they need to provide?
Representative Tuck, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. The birth certificate is already an eligibility requirement for any student.
Representative Learned, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I just got to push back on that because it's required for students playing high school sports. I'm asking specifically about middle school sports. Middle school sports are not required to provide the birth certificate. So you're saying that they are required. So is all middle school sports participants required to provide original birth certificates now? And then doesn't that then prevent any adopted kid from playing middle school sports?
Representative Tuck, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question, Representative. I can look into whether there needs to be clarification in terms of the middle and high school. It was my understanding that the eligibility requirements are the same for middle and high school sports.